Hey guys, welcome back to the Launch Your Real Life podcast, where we talk about what it takes for young Christians to launch out on their own into the real world. We talk about finances, we talk about community, careers, and how all those things work together with our faith so that we can reach our full potential and do what we were meant to do in the kingdom. So today I'm super excited because finally, for the first time, I have an interview so you guys get to hear from somebody who's not me. And this is somebody who's really special to me. He is the Great Commission pastor at Tate Springs Baptist Church, which happens to be my church. His name is Curtis James. He's been in ministry for a long time, and he's seen a lot, he's experienced a lot, and I can tell you that personally, as somebody who's under him at this church, just the level of encouragement he gives. Every time he talks to me about my kids, he's known me since before I had kids, and he's always giving an encouraging word. He's always uplifting parents and families, and so I wanted to get his take on a few things. And given that this podcast is usually run about 20 minutes, and there's a natural dividing point, I'm going to go ahead and break this up into two episodes so that you can really absorb everything. And the first half, this episode is going to be more general about finances and family and faith. And Curtis has some really great thoughts on those things that we already talk about on this podcast. And then the next one, he's actually going to go into detail in next week's episode. He's going to go into detail about a research paper that he was working on, specifically revolving around student debt and Christian higher learning education spaces and the effects. And we talk about some things that if you are in that phase of life considering, or you're about to go to school or whatever, what have you, some things to think about. So that'll be next week. But this week, I'm super excited to welcome Curtis and to talk to him. So without any further ado, let's get into the interview. Well, Curtis, thank you so much for jumping on this podcast, for being the brave first.
Honored to be a part of it, in the inaugural podcast. So this one will go down in history, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to actually having a dialogue. Sometimes it's hard to just like talk about stuff like I'm an expert and can communicate fairly. So I'm super excited. So obviously, a lot of the listeners who will listen to this will probably listen because you're in it. But I do want to have you introduce yourself, tell us about who you are and what you do um, at the church.
Yeah, so I'm Curtis James. I am the Great Commission pastor at Tate Springs Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas, and I've been here for almost 9 years. And so it's been a minute. I oversee all of our family ministry, but also all of our missions, men's ministry, women's ministry, small groups, kind of oversee most of the ministries of the church, and people in all different kinds of walks of life, but do a lot of work with families, with children and teens in the home and things like that, and kind of navigating life through those things.
Absolutely. And I am one of those people that you are pastoring and shepherding, and the insight that you bring when it comes to family and children is just is incredible. It brings peace, it brings comfort, and it brings inspiration, frankly. But this podcast in particular is right up that alley because it is aimed at um, specifically towards young people who are trying to leave the nest. Trying to maybe they're graduating high school and going off to college. Maybe they are leaving college and entering a career or jumping straight to the career, but they're wanting to, maybe they're looking at the world that is saying, like, look, it can't be done. Everything's too bad. I'm going to stay with my parents because who can afford rent these days and all those things. And talk about how that's not, staying strategically staying with your family for a certain period of time for a certain reason isn't a bad thing. It's not something we judge. But can you tell me, in your experience, what the important thing, you can tell me I'm wrong, of young people in that phase of life actually separating and going off on their own?
Yeah, I think that, well, I think it's biblical, but it's also a cultural norm that we deal with. So
Mhm.
as Americans, we look at it and say, well, kids need to get out of the house. Like I have two sons, and I told them both many years ago, you can't stay here. You're going to have to go find your own place at a certain point in your life. Now, we have to acknowledge that's a cultural norm for us, but it's not a
Right.
cultural norm in most of the world. Multi-generational homes is extremely common around the world. The difference that we're talking about here is about leaving the home um, emotionally and mentally and physically, going to work, having a career, engaging and being responsible for yourself. Ultimately, you can go to other countries that have multi generational homes as a commonplace item, and you'll find that it's the 17, 18, 19, 21, 25-year old that's actually really probably supporting the family by that time.
Mm.
While the older family members in the home, the parents who are in their 50s or 60s, they are they are backing down their workload, and the younger children, adult children in the home, are really the ones who are supporting the home. The Bible talks about when we get married, we leave our family. Yes, that's a physical aspect, but it's more of a mental, emotional, spiritual aspect that says,
Right.
this is now my full responsibility, and it's no one else's responsibility. And I think that's the dynamic that we face when we talk about leaving the home, going out on your own, and those kinds of things is about how are we as parents engaging our kids to live life as adults, as independent individuals in this world, within our cultural setting, and as teens and young adults, how are we engaging in adult activity as mature believers and followers of Christ that are displaying spiritual maturity as we walk through it? And I think that those are the questions we have to ask, because we live in a world where parents just kind of manage a lot of the time their home, but don't lead it. And I think we have to be in the business of leadership in our homes. And that's a vision casting and helping our kids make it to that next step. Even in a world where there are some boundaries and barriers that are harder to overcome right now, with the cost of rent and houses and all those kinds of things. Those are real, but they are also overcomable. And so we've seen it. I've seen so many young adults now off on their own in their own places and things like that, that kind of thought it might have been impossible. So I think that's an important aspect of understanding what we're talking about. It's really more about that maturity and owning
Right.
and being responsible.
Right. Yeah, that makes so much sense that it's not necessarily about the placement, it's about the emotional and the spiritual maturity. I mean, and to be fair to parents, back in the day, I used to look and be like, "Man, how are these parents just letting their kids stay around? How are they still taking care of their
Yeah.
kids?" And then I now have kids, granted they're 5 and under, but it's so easy to manage instead of giving ownership over. And back when I was 20, a 17-year-old looked a lot older than now when I'm like, "Man, they're still just a kid." So I can only imagine when my son is 17, 18 years old, that maybe feeling like, helping him take ownership and kind of leave, at least in in the sense of like owning a career or a college choice and journey. I can see how that might feel a little bit like, well, no, it makes sense that I'm still kind of holding the umbrella over him. So definitely can see how that makes sense. And it has to be, intentionally thought through and prayed through as parents. Um, yeah, definitely. Because you think you are an adult, but and to your point, we're delineating the difference between, you know, staying in the home, but still owning your own life, career,
Mhm.
family, and, maybe being stunted growth wise because you don't have to get a full time job. Maybe you're still doing part time at the Chick-fil-A because you don't have to go actually look for a full time career and make those steps, because you have that kind of protection. So I love that you make that distinction.
Yeah, it is the balance that we have as parents where we kind of have to navigate through these things. And we say this all the time in our family ministry, but parenting leads to the maturity of the parent, not the child. It's us as parents who actually grow and become really mature adults. I just don't know any 18-year-olds that I'm like, there they are spiritually completely mature. They're done, you know. No, they're still young and they're still learning. They're entering a new stage of young adult life. But the truth is, you know, parenting truly leads to the maturity of the parent, and it's the maturing process of the kid. But we're the ones who, by the time we're done with that process, are become kind of fully formed adults. It's the process
Right.
we go through.
Right. And yeah, I'm smack in the middle of it for sure. Or at the beginning stages rather. But so thank you for speaking into that. And because you know, um the young people that listen to this, again, they're getting the message that it can't be done, or maybe they're being shamed, like, "Man, you should be so much farther than you are right now."
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really about taking those steps. And as a, you know, hopefully you have parents that will help you make those steps. And a lot of times it's just kind of a very nebulous process.
Mhm.
And so, one of my goals with the podcast is to actually, hopefully help provide steps, but yeah, I wanted to shift a little bit because I've been excited to talk to some real church leaders, some ministers, um, about giving, because that's
Mhm.
another thing we talk a lot about on this podcast is the importance of establishing giving as a baseline, and kind of an easy baseline and an easy metric that we talk about in the Christian community is, of course, a tithe. And I
Mhm.
understand that tithe looks, different when we say it than it did, when it was first brought up in the Old Testament. And then there's debate on, like, are we subject to the tithe, and then is it an obligation, or is it we do it out of a giving spirit? So I understand there's all that nuance, but I do think that we are called to give generously, and especially to our local church.
Yes.
Um, and I do think that I've seen some studies, I've read some books. Uh, I've been a part of meetings at our church where it's brought up kind of the disparity in giving, and and in correlation to that, activity and service in the church. So there's kind of this classic 80-20 rule where 20% of the church is doing like 80% of the work. And I think that that could even maybe more so apply to giving. Um,
Mhm.
so is that something that you've seen not just at Tate Springs, but just in your career in general? First of all, out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I served in a church that was in a relocation process at one point, and it was a lot of, you know, financial things moving around and everything. And we kind of did a deep dive on our church's finances. And what we found was in that setting that if 100% of the people in the church gave 10% as just the 10% is something we talk about from the tithe that we see in the Old Testament. So it's just a good starting point for us that if the whole church gave 10%, it meant that the average income of our church per family was about $16,000 a year. And that obviously was not what it was.
Right.
And so what we were saying is, well, if people gave 10% and they're only making $35,000 a year, they would double our budget. And so it's very true that, unfortunately, the vast majority of people who attend church don't give it all. But then when you talk about giving something substantial, something like 10%, something sacrificial, that number goes down considerably. And it's interesting because, you know, to me, it's a lack of understanding because we are the church. Like, I am the church, you are
Right.
the church. So giving to the church is no different than like paying my electrical bill. Okay. When I
Right.
pay my electric bill, I benefit from paying my electric bill. So does everybody else in my family. They all
Right.
appreciate that I pay my electric bill. But I'll be honest with you, if I was the only one living in the house, I would still pay my electric bill, right? Because I get electricity from that. I utilize that. It's a part of my makeup in my family. And so when we look at the concept of giving or not giving to the church, realizing we are the church, to me, it's similar to saying like, well, I'm just going to stop washing my left hand. I'm just not going to wash it anymore. I'm not going to wash it. Maybe I'll wash it every few months, but it's my left hand. I'm right-handed. So, I do most things with my right hand. Well, no one would do that. If I
Right.
said, well, I haven't washed this left hand in 2 years, 3 years, I mean, I would probably become sick. My hand could get some sort of infection or something if I never washed it. It would be to my own detriment to disregard that part of my body. But as the church, we are the body of Christ working together. And as individual churches and communities, we're a biblical collection of that body working
Mhm.
together. And so, which body part are we going to choose to neglect? And so ultimately, it feels to me like tithing or giving shouldn't be a discipline as it's taught, but instead it should be evidence of our faith. And I think it is evidence of our faith.
I like that.
So giving and tithing is simply the byproduct of living the faithful life to Christ. It's just like we were talking about a minute ago, it's a sign of spiritual maturity. It
Yeah.
shows that my faith has grown, and what you'll find is the more your faith grows, the more you end up giving away, because God's economic plan is freely you have received, therefore freely you must give, right? You got it
Yeah.
to give it away. That's his whole economic plan. And so for us, when we look at it and say, "Oh, I'm not gonna give to my church," or "I can't afford it," or whatever, which I understand sometimes things get really hard, we give what we can, and we realize that God's faithful with that and that he sees that. And that should be a reflex, a byproduct of being a believer of Christ, not a discipline that we beat our bodies into. And I think that that's maybe the difference, is the realization that we are the church. We are not just a member of the church. We are the church, and so engaging in giving should just be a regular part of our lives, and it is an evidence of our faith. And I think that that's an important thing to remember.
Yeah, I love that. I think that is something that we struggle with in our culture, and I think it's evidenced by the stats. But I mean, I think that we're missing that it's a byproduct of the faith that we have. And I know that there's probably some churches out there that maybe they have people come to their church and they might spend their first 6 months at that church without ever realizing that there's anything expected of them. Right? I love that at our church, Jared weekly, we pass the plate so that there's a visual reminder. And also, Jared will talk about how it's part of worship. So there's really no excuse for us to say like, oh, we don't know, that this is a part of our faith that we exercise. And yeah, I think once you realize that, um, and one of the things I tell young people when I talk to them is, and it's almost the same idea as of investing, is that if you start when you're young, if you just your first job, you are already, maybe because your parents teaching or because you're already involved at church, like, I'm going to give 10% of this just as a
Yeah.
baseline. When you're slinging pizzas, it doesn't feel like a lot, but it means when you get that big boy job, I know there are people graduating now who are going straight into jobs making more than I still ever have in my
Hmm.
life. And if that is already built into the way that you do your money, that's a whole lot easier when you first get into that job to be like, no, I'm living off of 90% of this rather than, and giving that 10%. And so I think sometimes we get lost in, oh, I don't, as a student or whatever, like I don't make enough to make a difference. The church doesn't need my 20
Yeah.
bucks.
Yeah.
And then it's
The
like, well, it's
mistake
not about
is,
that. Yeah.
yeah, the mistake is to believe that it's about how much we give.
Right.
Um, we got to remember the guy we're giving to already has everything. It's not about how much we give, it's that we give faithfully. And that's what he wants to see from us. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do with how much that is.
Absolutely. And if you come to Christ and you're midway through your career and you're making top dollar and you've already, uh, again, in terms of ease of coming into obedience, and you suddenly realize, okay, obedience means being generous to my church. And of course, that's a byproduct of my faith. But that means that in the process of that, they're digging deep to make that happen because they haven't had to.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that is 100% true. And I do hope, I really hope for a generation that will come up with that idea so that it's not, you know, maybe a senior adults heavy givers, but that it is across the board we all give. Because as you said, I mean, I can only imagine the numbers that you gave, what it would look like in our local churches in general if people just simply started tithing.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
what could we do in a community?
it would change the church across it actually changed the church across the world. It wouldn't just change what happens in the US. But
Mm.
yeah, it would be pretty radical.
Whew. Well, I also wanted to ask you, in your experience working with families, for, you said almost a decade, and even before that. I mean, when you're in ministry, you're working with families. But I wanted to ask, in your experience, have you noticed a connection or any kind of causation or connection between a family that is experiencing financial struggles? And again, we are fully acknowledging that some financial struggles happen because circumstances just go crazy. And I'm not digging anybody for that. But have you noticed a correlation between like financial struggle and then like family strife and how that plays out in their family and faith?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because um I have watched families that have a lot
Mhm.
uh go through strife, and I've watched families that have a little go through strife, or even less than a little at times. And it's interesting to see, so a lot of times we make life choices, financial or just not financial. A lot of times
Right.
they show themselves in financial decisions,
True.
where we're just not very responsible with what God has given us, whether we're not responsible with our time, not responsible with our money, not responsible with our resources. Aren't taking care of our car. We aren't taking care of our house. We're not taking care of these kinds of things. Then what happens is when something really hard comes along, maybe a major health issue happens in the
Mhm.
family. Well, now, oh, I've got this huge burden that comes in because of this health issue. Maybe the person who has the health issue can no longer work. And so you've got to go 3 months, 6 months, a year without their income. Maybe their medical bills are very high, whatever. The problem is that I'm now facing that struggle while also needing to fix my car and needing to fix my house and needing to take care of things that I haven't properly maintained. I haven't been a good
Mhm.
steward of over that time. When that happens, then this health issue that's an uncontrollable issue that comes in creates a much bigger financial problem in our lives. Okay, as well as other problems that we can face, but as we talk about it in that financial lens, and it becomes this insurmountable problem that we face. So sometimes we can do things that prepare ourselves for the hard times, and that's not about, oh, how much is in your savings account. I wouldn't want you to
Mhm.
look at mine right now. I can tell you that. But but it does come down to just taking care of things along the way so that when something does go south, you're actually not already underwater. And I think that
Mhm.
that's a really important thing. And when you see families that don't have much, but they've been faithful with what they've have, and
Yeah.
things get hard, then you actually see families that galvanize together and their faith
Mhm.
grows and they're a witness to everyone around them. But when you see families who haven't taken care and been good stewards of what they have, then all those pressures come in and it causes all kinds of strife, because the foundations aren't there. And the way we handle our money is usually a reflection on how we're living other areas of our life as well. Now, the flip side is you take the family that has a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe they have a lot of money and a lot of different things. It's I see just as much strife in those families when life circumstances come because they have outsourced everything. Everybody else does stuff for them, and they, in our culture, accrue so much responsibility because,
Mhm.
in my situation, I've got a house and I have 2 cars, you know? I don't
Right.
have a vacation home. I don't have a boat. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a vacation home or a boat, by the way. If you have them, great, awesome, wonderful. I'm sure you can afford them. But, I don't have a lot of these other things. Well, when things go sideways, if I'm leveraged out, even though I have a lot, but I have so much stuff and I have so many insurance payments and tax payments and all these things that have to be kept up with. Well, in that case, my stuff ends up owning me. Well, when stuff
Mhm.
gets south, it's really hard to keep up with all of that. So I do think
Yeah.
there's two sides to that coin. And in those homes, strife is pretty profound as well. I would say just as profound as the home that's struggling that maybe doesn't have enough. Ultimately, the cool thing that happens is in the family that's been faithful, they've been engaged in their church, they've been giving to their church whatever they could. They're taking care of their stuff's old, they don't have much, and then something terrible happens. What naturally happens at that point is the church just pours into those people. And I don't just mean our church, even though I have seen it in our church,
Mhm.
but
Right.
all the churches I've been a part of step in and help fill the gaps. And it's a natural thing that the church does because if you read Acts, it's exactly what happened when the church started. We shared everything. Now, the people who have a lot of people just don't even think that they need anything. And so I think that can be a struggle. And so I think that the pendulum can swing really far both ways, and we always want to be careful, regardless of whether you have a lot or little. What you're faithful with is actually going to dictate how you weather those storms. And if your family is completely reliant on your money because you have it, that's not going to go well. And if your family is in disarray because you haven't been a good steward of what you have, then your family is going to struggle. And so I think that it's the same thing is true in both settings. As long as we're being faithful with whatever God has given us, then we will be ready to weather some of those storms.
Yeah. That's what I was hearing throughout everything you just said was it's about stewardship.